What up, nerds, nerdettes, non-binary nerd humans? Hope everyone's having a great apocalypse so far. I am Nateinthewild, and welcome back to another edition of Nature Nate's Nifty Natography Instruction. I need to work on that. I'll come up with something better. Tune in next time. I don't know. We'll see. Time lapses. Let's chat about those.
This is where I wanna be. Nah, nah, nah. Never ever gonna leave. Nah, nah, nah. You ain't know you live for me. Nah, 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 nah.
So every Tuesday on my Instagram, I try to post a time lapse. I call it #TimeLapse Tuesday. And I get so many questions. People are asking about, what's your interval? What's your shutter speed? How do you edit these? And I have to admit, it is really overwhelming when you're first getting started in it. But once you have a little bit of an understanding of how time lapses function and how to make a video out of all these still images, it's actually super easy. So let's talk about time lapses start to finish. And I think by the end of this, it's going to be pretty easy for all of us. We're going to go out tomorrow morning. I'm going to shoot a time lapse. We'll edit it together, start to finish. Here we go. So a video is just a series of still images played back to back in rapid succession. The human brain has a processing lag time of around 100 milliseconds, or 1/10 of a second. This means that if you see a bunch of sequential things 1/10 of a second apart, your brain kind of blurs them together to form some sort of motion. A video just basically capitalizes on that by recording 24 or 30 or 29.97, whatever, frames per second and playing them back to you at that exact speed. Your brain interprets this as continuous motion. At its most basic level, this is actually how things like flipbooks work, where you draw a silly smiley face changing over each page, and when you play it back fast, it appears as though that stick figure is jumping or running or whatever. Videos just use the same concept. Now, unlike videos where you record 30 frames in 1 second and play those 30 frames back over 1 second, a time lapse, we're just going to record those 30 frames over the course of a minute, or 10 minutes, or an hour, and then play them back over the course of 1 second. This condenses a large period of time into a short video and causes this really cool effect where time seems like it's flying by. People use different video frame rates. They'll use 24 frames per second, or 23.997, or 29.997, or 30. Now, because I suck at math, I use 30 frames per second. There's 60 seconds per minute, 60 minutes per hour. 60 and 30 are pretty easy to divide by each other, and that just simplifies everything for me. From there, we're able to do some pretty simple math to figure out how long we need to shoot in order to get a video of a certain length at the end. So say you're taking one photo every second. That means 1 minute of time-lapsing will give you 60 frames. Well, 60 divided by 30 is 2 seconds. So 1 frame per second for 1 minute will be a 2-second final video. Still with me? Now that's just an example. I would never recommend shooting just a 2-second time lapse. I've done it in the past on accident, and it is a very uncomfortable tease. So I always aim for 300 frames as a minimum. This gives me 10 seconds of final video output, which is long enough to be satisfying as a standalone, but if I need it to fit into a shorter time frame in a video, I can always speed ramp it a little bit as well. So I always like to start by thinking about what I'm taking a time lapse of, which will give me a little bit of a feel for how long I'm going to be shooting. If I'm filming an intersection with pedestrians crossing and cars turning, 5 to 10 minutes will probably be enough to show the hustle and bustle of a city. But something like a sunset on a mountaintop, that's gonna take me an hour to an hour and a half, right? Like 30 minutes of golden light as the sun goes down, another 20 or so minutes of pink and gold clouds, and then 20 minutes into the blue hour and twilight gives you a full, complete concept of this sunset from start to finish. So let's dive into this a little bit and use a real-world example. A full hour on the mountain shooting sunset will be 60 minutes, times 60 seconds per minute is 3,600 seconds. You take this 3,600 seconds and you divide it by 300 frames, which is our target goal for a 10-second video. This means that a 12-second interval will give us exactly a 10-second time lapse. Now, as mentioned, you can always speed up time lapses later, but you can never slow them down beyond a certain frame rate without them starting to look jumpy. For me personally with sunsets, I like to really embellish the part where the golden clouds are moving and changing from yellow into pink. And so I shoot with about a 6, 7, or an 8 second interval depending on how much cloud motion there is. This gives me around a 15 to 20 second final video, so you can speed past the boring parts and slow down for when the clouds are cool. It gives you a little bit to play with, and that's something that I personally have found to be really enjoyable. Okay, so we've talked about all the basics of time lapses. I think there's only one thing left, and that's to head out into the field and shoot one together. I'll walk you through setting up my composition, adjusting all of the exposures and everything as the light changes, and then we'll come back here and edit it together. It is about 6 p.m. here. I'm gonna go out for sunrise tomorrow, I think. I'll catch you there. Okay, we are out and about at the famous Seattle Gasworks Park. We've got some nice sunshine here, which is pretty rare. You might catch me whispering a little bit as this goes on, because I am weirdly camera shy about talking into a camera while I'm out in public. I actually hate it, maybe more than anything in the world, so YouTubing is a terrible career choice for me, but here we go. Who are you? What are you doing here? Hey. Okay, 6 feet away, we gotta be safe. Just real quick right off the bat, before you leave your house, obviously, make sure your camera batteries are charged. That's like probably the #1 thing to think about. And then also make sure you got a clear memory card. It's kind of shocking when you're taking 42 megapixel photo and you take 300 of them, how quickly that can fill up a card. So don't go out with only 15 gigabytes left on your card, a 30% full battery, because nothing is worse than getting your time lapse cut short because of something silly like that. Okay, I'm crouching down because there's a lot of people around and I'm feeling really shy and it's awkward. So you guys are crouching with me now. Don't tell me if somebody gets close. I hate this, I hate this. But okay, so the time lapse is running. It's up there. Should be done maybe in the next like 5 or 10 minutes, then we can go home and edit it and my personal nightmare will be over. But in the meantime, let's talk about some of the important things for this time lapse. So first things first, I have it on manual focus. The problem with autofocus for a time lapse is that your camera doesn't always focus perfectly every single time. It kind of jumps between frames and you end up with this really, really weird, actually very uncomfortable looking, they call it focus breathing. So manual focus, extremely important. Beyond manual focus, you also want to use manual white balance. Auto white balance is okay, you can get away with it, but it's not my preferred way to go. You're going to want to do a manual white balance, especially if you're doing something where the camera would struggle with white balance anyways. For example, astrophotography, any sort of astro time lapse. Sunsets, usually I'll pick a white balance and I'll leave it set on that. But in general, that's a little bit less important. And then beyond that, exposure adjustments. Most built-in intervalometers, especially on the Sonys here, will actually compensate for exposure as they go. And the one on the Sony is really, really good, especially for daytime shots like this. But for transitional ones, a sunset or the holy grail from daytime into night, you really, really want to do a manual exposure adjustment. So the way I do that is I pick a point on my histogram with my exposure, like negative 0.3 or right at even, and I just try to keep it there. And you'll notice as the lighting changes from bright to dark or dark to bright, depending on the time of day, it'll slowly fade. And all you do is just change the shutter speed, change the aperture to keep it balanced, keep it as close to that center point as you can. And then you'll see actually when we get back and we start editing all these in LR Time-lapse that it's incredibly easy to smooth out those little transitions and it ends up looking like a seamless time-lapse. Something worth mentioning, however, when you are adjusting your exposure, be extremely careful to not bump your tripod legs. I've ruined about 15 time lapses by accidentally giving this a little nudge when I'm making my exposure adjustments. So don't touch your camera too often. Another thing to keep in mind is to not just completely forget about it, because I've done that too. Sunrises and sunsets are like shockingly really smooth and gradual. And when you're just sitting out there, it's kind of like the frog in the boiling pot. You know, you forget that it's happening and suddenly you're at +5 exposure and it's unsalvageable. I actually have some samples of that, so let me show you one. right? Looks ridiculous. So be careful, be aware of your exposure, but don't be overbearing about it. Okay, so the time lapse there's running. You can see it's about halfway through. I'm gonna just kick back and relax a little bit. We'll let that finish up, and then I'm gonna head home and we'll edit that sucker together. So we're back home with a memory card full of photos from our time lapse, and we want to get started on the editing process. Unlike your usual workflow in Lightroom where you would immediately put these into the card reader and then import them into your library catalog, we're actually going to take these and offload them just directly onto our computer's internal hard drive in a separate folder specifically for these time-lapse photos. That's going to save us a lot of editing time here because reading off of these cards, even though they're blisteringly fast, they're not as fast as your internal hard drive. And when we're dealing with anywhere from 300 to 3,000 individual photos, saving even 10% of our editing time can be hours of processing down the line. Once we have all of these inside their own folder, we're going to open up LR Time-lapse and navigate to the folder those photos are in order to start our processing. So I'm going to click on the Gasworks Time-lapse folder, and you can see that as it first opens, it analyzes all of these photos individually. There's a little bit of a processing lag as it measures the luminance and the exposure and any sort of variance within that, and it'll start drawing individual lines over this, basically mapping transitions, doing all sorts of calculations and taking the work out of our hands. You can see that the small blue line on the top there, that's measuring our exposure. Since nothing really changed much here, that line is more or less flat. You'll notice that there's some up and down bumps in the blue line, and that's just a little bit of flicker, we call it. Small changes in the exposure, small variances in the brightness of the frame due to clouds passing in front of the sun, things like that. Now the cool thing about LR Time-lapse is that the processing more or less works left to right, following these buttons along the top. So I click Keyframes Wizard to get started, and it's basically just going to assign a number of keyframes that it thinks is appropriate for this time lapse. Since nothing changed much here, it says 1 keyframe, but I'm going to go up to 3 keyframes just to talk a little bit about the processing capabilities of the program. Now, if this had been a day to night or a night to day time lapse with a huge transition, we would be using what they call the Holy Grail Wizard to help ramp those massive exposure adjustments. That'll be a subject for a future video. We don't have to worry about it right now. So then we click Save. All this does is write the XMP metadata into the folder with your photos. It marks those 3 photos as keyframes so that we can use those for the editing process. Now is when we drag these into Lightroom. So I have Lightroom open in the back. I just click this button that says Drag to Lightroom and literally drag it into Lightroom. Couldn't be easier. Since these are already on our hard drive, we don't have to do any sort of importation presets or anything. We're just taking it from the HD to my catalog. I don't ever change anything here. I just click import. This process is usually pretty quick because they're already on our internal hard drive. This is just Lightroom basically building out a catalog for these photos. It should take a minute at the most. Once they're all in there, the next step is to right-click on any of the photos and go to Folder in Library. This basically just navigates you away from your full catalog and shows Lightroom that you're just working within this subset. Now, when you go down to the bottom here, you'll notice that it has it marked as LRT full sequence. So that means every photo that you took for this time lapse. We're going to select LRT keyframes, and so it brings up those 3 photos that we marked as keyframes and gives us a baseline for processing. From there, we're just going to edit this as though it's a normal photo. We're going to hit D to move over into the Develop module, and then we're going to begin treating this as though we would any other photo. Now, because this is going to be a video as its final output, I start off by enabling the profile correction and then cropping to 16:9 just to get ahead of the game a little bit here. Now, it looks like I might not have leveled my horizon properly, so I'm going to gently adjust that. Get everything nice and level. And then I'm going to just basically give this a pretty quick and dirty edit here. We don't have to do anything fancy. This is kind of just for the purposes of demonstration. So I'm going to change my white balance just a tad, add some contrast, a little bit of clarity, some saturation. Nothing super fancy. Now, if you do have a more complicated time lapse that requires something like a radial filter or a graduated filter, you'll notice that when you import through LR Time-lapse, it actually drops 2 radial filters in there out of a default, and then 4 graduated filters from bottom to top. Those are just programmed in there because they will transfer from keyframe to keyframe for you. So if you have something like the moon moving across the sky and you apply a selective edit to it, LR Time-lapse will smoothly transition from first keyframe to last keyframe and actually move the radial filter across the frame for you. In this instance, we don't really have anything that would necessitate that, so I'm going to avoid them. Once you have the first photo edited, it's super easy from there. I just shift-click to select the other 3 keyframes, click the LR Time-lapse button up at the top of Lightroom Classic, and then sync keyframes. Boom, quick and easy. So you can see now that my edits have been applied uniformly across all 3 keyframes. Super quick, super easy. Now that all 3 photos are edited, we're going to save that metadata and move back into LR Time-lapse. So with all 3 selected in the Library tab, click Metadata and then Save Metadata to Files. Go back into LR Time-lapse and you click Reload. It's going to apply the edits that you made in Lightroom, including your crop, any sort of exposure adjustments, and then it's going to just adjust those 3 keyframes based on your Lightroom edits. When you hit auto transition, it's going to calculate those 3 edited photos and apply those across the board for all photos in there. When you click visual preview, what it's going to do is start rendering those edits across all 300 photos and seamlessly transition them from start to finish. Depending on the intensity of your edits here, this might take a while. If you're just doing a daylight transition like this one, it's going to be fairly quick. But for a 800 photo daytime to nighttime transition, this might take a solid 30 to 45 minutes. This one was pretty straightforward, so it might only take 2 or 3 minutes, but this is always a good time to kind of relax, kick back, enjoy yourself a little bit.
I want a big fancy car with the top back and shopping bags filled to the brim.
So once the visual previews are rendered, we actually have our first sneak peek at the fully edited time-lapse. It's not perfect, there's still going to be some weird exposure flickers and everything, but it's fun to take a little sneak preview. Let's check it out really quick. Oh yeah, that's cool! Look at that, go little sailboats. The sailboats go zooming across the screen. That's fun. That's fun. All right. So now we got to get rid of those slight exposure adjustments caused by the clouds moving over the sun. Super easy. Once again, we're just working left to right. It seems intimidating, but you literally just click left to right in LR Time-lapse. So I click Visual Deflicker. It has some options here for how much you want to smooth it, and that green line overlaid on the pink line kind of gives you a general idea of how much it's going to change. This time-lapse doesn't have a lot going on, so I'm going to just leave it at its default. It's 10 out of 50 smoothing. That should get the job done. You see all the frames more or less fit inside the green there. Looks pretty smooth. I'm going to click Apply. It's going to re-render these visual previews, which will take another 5 to 10 minutes. No big deal, so we just sit and wait it out. All right, looks good. So we're going to navigate back into Lightroom, and now we are going to go back down into this bottom Lightroom bar, change the LRT5 keyframes back to full sequence. This pulls up all 300 photos in addition to the 3 keyframes that we edited. And you'll see the edits are still only applied to our keyframes. The rest of them still look like they're unedited raw photos. Hit Command A or Control A if you're a PC user to select all the files. Click Metadata, and then click Read Metadata from Files. It's going to take a second to interpret these edits, and it's basically importing the edits that LR Time-lapse calculated and just applies them to all of them. So instead of individually editing 300 photos and manually calculating all these transitions, I edited 3 photos, clicked a couple buttons, spun around in my chair for 10 minutes, and all 300 are edited. We're basically done. So we export these back into LR Time-lapse. Once again, it's a seamlessly integrated software, so I just hit export as though it's any old Lightroom file. Instead of hard drive though, I click export time-lapse to the LRT thing. Now I'm using the pro version. I've paid for the top tier license because I use this for my job. So I have them exporting at 6K, TIFF at 16 bits. We don't really need that for this, so I'm going to step it back to JPEG at 8 bits, 4K, just to save some time, save a little hard drive space, etc. that's pretty much it. Click export. This is probably the most time-consuming part of the entire process here. It's going to export 300 full resolution photos. It's not quick. I have a pretty fast Mac and it still takes 15 to 20 minutes, so let's play the whole music and kill some time, eh?
I want a big fancy car with the top back and shopping bags filled to the brim in the back.
Oh, I've never been good at that. My plan was to comedically chug the entire beer, but I'm not good at that. I never have been. I don't even know how I graduated college with those skills. So the files have finished exporting from Lightroom. My computer sounds like a helicopter taking off in a hurricane, because that's an immense amount of processing power, I suppose, exporting that many photos in a row. It automatically opens up the video render dialog in LR Time-lapse. We're going to select our video output dimensions, which are pretty standard for me. Since it's already 16:9, we don't have to force output. I select 4K UHD because I like that personally better. We're going to put this one as MP4, H.264. I had it on H.265 HEVC for exporting an Aurora time-lapse that you might have seen in one of my other videos. That's just because it's a broader color space, which works better specifically for the greens and blues of an Aurora. For this, we don't have to worry about it. H.264 will be perfect. I'm going to put my frame rate at 30 because that's what I promised you when I started this video like 4 days ago. Should give us exactly a 10-second time lapse. We're going to click render and away we go. Again, this will take some time. Just sit back and wait. This one's usually pretty quick. Ooh, it's done. It's done. It's done. It's done. It's done. You guys, it's done. All right, let's open it up. Let's take a sneak peek here, make sure everything looks good, and if it does, there's no need to make any further adjustments. Oh yeah, look at her go. Those sailboats are flying, huh? And there you have it. Start to finish, time-lapse planning, calculating, taking, editing, rendering, exporting, YouTubing abouting. Simple, right? Honestly, not that complicated. Super overwhelming to get started with, but not that bad in the long run. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Nateinthewild again. I would love if you appreciated this tutorial to click the like button, the subscribe button, drop a comment down below. There's going to be a lot more of stuff like this coming up in the future, and I would love to see you all here. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you all next time.